I'm using the term crossing the bridge at the moment. It's kind of a working title, but I sort of see it as crossing the bridge to your future. Because I'm very hopeful about this whole process. I think everybody probably knows this, but one of the reasons that I've been invited to join this work is that I was very involved in exactly the same process in England several years ago now. And it was a huge learning experience for me, mainly in the ways that it failed. And so I think, you know, bringing that to this project has certainly been very valuable to me. And also that as a mini pilot project, I used some of the recommendations from the Unifying Framework with the early childhood educators at the Early Learning Centre in Colchester. And so I've started to see what some of the implementation of this might actually look like. So that's kind of the background here. And I know you already know this, but I think it's always useful to keep reminding ourselves of what we're doing here. Our focus is with the existing workforce. And I think, you know, there's some huge issues here. When anything new, you know this as well as anybody, when anything new comes along, there's always some trepidation with people who are thinking, how is this going to affect me? You know, what's really going to be happening here, and needing a tremendous amount of reassurance that this new system, whatever it's going to look like, is really going to value your expertise and your participation in the workforce. So I think, you know, the parameters of our study here are really focusing on the existing workforce, the skills that they bring, that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that we're really recognizing the contribution that everybody's making to the workforce, regardless of what the recommendations are about, for example, academic qualifications that the framework is saying. So I think that's, you know, an important point to keep reinforcing. We are keeping in line with the recommendations and the guidelines within the Unifying Framework that, you know, that provides our main guide in terms of where we're going with this whole project, and that our key objective is to make recommendations. You know, this is not a decision-making process. And I think that's, you know, it's important for us to keep coming back to that, that Vermont as a state has been, has been an early adopter in so many different initiatives. And this one is no different. We're looking at how can we actually be proactive in this process and not have things dumped on us, if you like, you know, that this is how it's going to be. We're actually saying, this is how we think it should be. This is what's going to work best for the workforce in Vermont. So we're being proactive in the process, but it is about making recommendations. It's not making set in stone decisions. And again, I think we have to keep bringing ourselves back to that. But with the pilot study, the development of that is with a view to rolling it out across the whole of the state. So in taking a small proportion, we're using that to look at the challenges, to look at the pitfalls, to look at where we make mistakes, to look at how we have to tweak and change things before we can actually say, you know what, we've got a really robust system now that we can roll out across the whole of the state. So the pilot study, I think, is going to be really useful for that part of the process in really helping us design something that is going to be really valuable for implementing the framework. Susan, does that fit with, so far, does that fit with what you were thinking in terms of the parameters?
Can you see me nodding?
Yeah. I can see you nodding, yes. But do jump in if I'm missing key things here, because I'm likely to do that. So just to review some of the key things about our pilot study and the selection of our sample, thanks to all of you, great big thanks to all of you. We're going to have approximately 130 participants, which is a really good size for any kind of pilot study. But I think particularly in relation to the scope of this project across the state of Vermont, 130 participants, is a good size for a pilot study, bearing in mind that we might not get all this data back. So starting with 130, we've got to be realistic about the amount of data that we're going to get back. Among the participants, we've got a variety of settings, a variety of roles, thinking about the ages of children that people work with, whether they're center-based, school-based, family-based, but with a focus on early childhood education responsibilities, which is why at this stage we've decided not to include after-school settings. Although, there may be some relevance there, we didn't really want to either make this too overly complicated or to muddy the water. So we're keeping the focus very firmly on early childhood education responsibilities solely. With geographical distribution, we've tried really hard to be as far and wide across the state as we can. We recognize that there will be gaps, and I think that's something that we're determined to address as we go along. If there are areas that we can see that are missing, that we will try and address that as we progress with the pilot study. But again, coming back to the fact that this is a snapshot. It's not perfect. We're using this pilot study to really try to be representative, but it's certainly not going to be perfect. But that's the case with any kind of pilot study. You try your best to have a sample that is as representative as possible, and that's really what we've tried to do here with our pilot study.
Can I add a couple things with that slide?
Yeah, please do.
A few things, just in terms of the after school, Megan, you raised that question of whether we should include them. And I remember there was a point early in our work when I asked that question of, maybe it was Lauren Hogan, I can't remember now. And she said, one way to think about this is when you think about that whole list of responsibilities, you remember the list that's in professional identity. After school programs are not responsible for that whole list of responsibilities. Children are getting those needs met in the course of their rest of the day program. And so that sort of helped me to kind of sort out. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be helpful or useful for a person in an after school to be licensed as an early childhood educator if they're working with that age group. However, they're not responsible and accountable for making sure that all of that learning is helping. So we decided to kind of sort it that way for that reason.
And I think just to clarify what my thought was, because I think I was thinking more about prior experience, not maybe your current position, like if you're currently working in after school, but like if you come through various positions and some of your years of experience were in after school, does that count for anything? It's okay if it doesn't, but I just think that there are times where people come into the world from different angles, and it is also a licensed setting. You are, in a lot of cases, held to certain health and safety standards. Do we want to acknowledge any crossover there, or is it totally just as would you if you taught first grade? You would, in theory, that would be experience that would count.
That's a great point. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. So no, that's fine.
Yep.
Sorry to muddy the waters.
No, you didn't. You didn't. So I wanted to mention that also Jenny and I, a couple of you had volunteered to be part of the sample, and we talked that through. And I think we're going to ask that you not do that, because we don't want you to be in the position of wearing two hats, of being a part of the pilot sample, participants, and also the task force is going to be looking through all of that data and collating and working with it. So I think Tammy and Jen are the two who I remembered who said that they would be willing to be part of the sample. I don't know if there was anyone else, but if so, we asked task force members not to be sample participants. Does that seem clear? And then the other thing I had in my notes, and I don't know if we'll wind up doing this, but just to flag it as a possibility, if we get all of this data back, and then we're working with it and we're collating and seeing what we've got. If we wind up saying, boy, we've got a real hole, we know of, sort of some profiles in the workforce that aren't in our sample, I think we at that point can figure out a way to reach out to fill that hole. For right now, we're going to hope that we don't have it, and we don't think we will, but we have to remain open to the possibility that we might be missing some key demographic here. So
Sure.
Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge, thank you to Sue, who found some public school folks to add into the sample. We'll look at that list in just a few minutes. Jen, you did some adjusting to pick up some of Sue's original participants. Lorraine beat the bushes up in the Northeast Kingdom and has come up with some good additions. Allison reached out in Rutland. I know you didn't get a response, but I think the attempt was still worthwhile. And Christina, I know you were trying to look into Grand Isle. I think Jenny and I talked a little bit about that, and we think that we're pretty well covered with the distribution. So I think that's fine. So, but thank you to those of you who did a little additional checking and seeing if you could bring in other participants.
Yeah, that's great, because that really has broadened the sample size quite considerably. So that's been fabulous for everybody. Thank you. So just moving on a little bit with this, and again, I think this is just refreshing where we're going with this. In relation to establishing equivalence, we started with a number of important questions, some of which were really geared around how are we facilitating the transfer of existing workforce to the new unifying framework? How are we valuing their experience? How are we validating their experience? And that, I think that is still a very challenging question for us in terms of how are we going to make sure that experience is not only counted in terms of its longevity, but in terms of its quality and its range and its diversity, because we have to think about equity in this whole process as well, and that we are completely transparent in how we're implementing it. So I think, that there are a lot of really important questions that we started with in looking at how we were going to put this whole study together, in thinking about establishing equivalence to the new designations of ECE 1, 2, and 3. And so the pilot study, as you know, is going to examine 3 main areas with educators in the existing workforce. So looking first of all at their education, their academic qualifications, but taking on board the guidance from the unifying framework, which states very clearly, as you know, that should not be the only criterion that we are utilizing. That we know full well that we have a number of educators in the workforce that do not have a bachelor's degree in early childhood education. That the framework is flagging up as the gold standard, but that's not going to be the only criterion that we're using in thinking about establishing equivalence and transfer to the new framework. So we're also going to be looking at relevant experience, and here we're thinking about across the whole age range from birth to 8, but also thinking about different settings where educators have worked. And I think Megan's comment there about working in after school is going to be an important consideration, that because the age range within the framework is from birth to 8. So looking at relevant experience, but also professional development that is also relevant, but also recent. And Susan and I had a number of conversations about this, taking on board questions that you have flagged up about the time frame here, because originally we thought, in line with other systems, that it would be 5 years. But bearing in mind particularly the COVID pandemic and the impact that has had on people's ability to either access professional development or engage in professional development, that's 2 years taken out of the timetable for a start. So I think to try and be fair about this process, then we've extended this to 10 years in thinking about recent and relevant professional development. So it's going to be looking at this whole picture. Educators education, their experience, and their professional development. And they're going to be the three main criteria that we are going to be assessing in looking at this whole process of transfer to the new framework. Susan, is there anything?
The only thing I would mention is, I guess, when we work with the worksheet today, which we're going to do, and you're going to just filling it out, and then we're going to have some discussion of I think it works. There are some opportunities to make. So I guess I'd just say that.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so finally then, just reviewing the steps of our project, the first of which is going to be collecting the data. And that's going to involve the distribution of the establishing equivalence worksheet, which as coordinators, you're going to play a crucial role in this. And I know that's something that we're going to look at later on in this meeting. But that's going to be the main way that we're collecting data about people's education, their experience, and their professional development. So utilizing the establishing equivalence worksheet is going to be the main way that we do that. And that has already had several incarnations from the original. And again, as a result of your input, your questions, your comments, we've been continuing to fine tune this worksheet. And I'm sure, we may well continue to do that after this meeting as well, but that's all a valuable part of the process, because the pilot study will help us to iron out all these challenges so that when we have this finalized, we've done the best job we possibly can, acknowledging that it's not going to be perfect because nothing ever is. But with the opportunity to review several drafts of this worksheet, it's helped us get to the position that we're in now, where I think we're fairly confident that it's a robust tool for collecting the data that we need. The next step in the project is going to be reviewing and collating that data. So the forms will go out, participants will fill them in, and they're going to be returning them to you as coordinators. And the job then will be to review and collate that data. And we're going to talk about that a bit later on, but really that process is going to involve sorting out participants who are very straightforward in terms of transfer to the new framework. And that will include educators who already have, for example, a bachelor's degree in early childhood education or a bachelor's degree in a related subject area. That process is going to be much more straightforward than participants who do not have the same kind of academic qualifications. And in that case, we're going to be taking a much closer look at their experience and their professional development in terms of them transferring to the new framework. So reviewing and collating the data is going to be the next important step in the project. We'll then be looking at distributing a survey, and I know we've talked a bit about this already, and you've started to maybe think about relevant questions. I know I drafted some questions that we'll actually be asking the participants in the study, and I think for me this is a really important part of the process. It's one of the reasons why this whole process in England was not successful, and that is it did not keep grounded in the workforce. Seeking out opinions and comments and questions at the grassroots, I think, is instrumental to the success of this project. And asking educators themselves how experience should be validated, what kinds of experience should be counted, what we should be looking for in terms of length of experience, breadth of experience, quality of experience, and seeking out ideas and comments and questions about that, I think is going to be a really important part of the process, as opposed to coming up with some kind of system and saying this is how it's going to be, but actually seeking out the opinion of people in the workforce as to what their ideas are about equivalence. So the survey will be distributed in the same way that the Establishing Equivalence worksheet is distributed, and will then be returned to you as coordinators so that we can review the survey results, because that's going to be very informative in terms of how we move forward in designing a process for transfer of existing educators into the new framework, and recommendation for licensure, either at designation 1, 2, or 3. So we're going to be taking all this information from the Establishing Equivalence worksheets that's about participants' education, their experience and their professional development, and their responses to the survey. So we're going to be taking all that information to design the process that will then enable us to look at transferring the workforce to the new framework. I think that in this process, we will also be ironing out a lot of challenges, mistakes, things that we need to look at more closely if we're going to be rolling this out on a large scale. You know, I think we will get some answers to a lot of questions as a result of this pilot project. We are going to be taking guidance from existing systems, for example, at the Community College of Vermont, their accreditation of prior learning system, the Agency of Education's peer review process. But I think for me, and I'm sure you know you're concerned about this too, the focus should be on the specific needs of the early childhood education workforce. And a couple of the things that concern me about some of the existing systems is how heavily reliant they are on academic written work, or written work in general. Write a report about, reflect on your experience in this, and it's requiring participants to very heavily on writing. And I think we have to be very mindful here of equity. And if we're just basing assessment on participants' ability to write a report reflecting on their experience with working with babies or toddlers, or then already we're perhaps placing some participants at disadvantage. So I think, you know, although we know there are systems in place that work really well, I also think we have to be mindful of equity with our process, and that we're going to be using, I think, a range of different assessment techniques when we're looking at people's experience and validating that. So it should not be too heavily weighted on written responses. So we're really keeping our focus on the diverse nature of the early childhood education workforce, because I think that's really, really important. That's the last bit in my summary, Susan. I don't know if there's other things that I've missed. There probably are, or things that you wanted to add at this stage.
Yeah, I can add a couple of things. One is actually three things, I think. One is that the survey, I think what we will do is use a Survey Monkey, that platform. So that should be an easy way of getting information back from the participants. So we can, coordinators' roles will be to help just encourage people to complete it so that we get a good response rate. The second thing I wanted to talk about is when you look at that, use all of this information to design a process for transferring the existing, that bullet. Jenny and I met with Janet McLaughlin to kind of go over this for her, and the proposal is that from June on, that Jenny be able to lead that process for us, and we'll be looking for at least a couple task force members. We're thinking that would be a small design group that would do some work and then bring it back to the task force for affirmation and tweaking and so on. I've also asked Melissa Du Bois, who's you may know is at CCV and is in charge of all of their assessment of prior learning, focused portfolio development, course challenge. She's just got so much knowledge in alternative ways to, you know, assess learning. I've asked her if she would consider being part of this in some way, and she gave a tentative yes. So I think that's going to be a great resource. And then the other thing that isn't here that will be kind of paralleling those last couple bullets will be that we're going to put all of this work into a package that Rachel and I will work on that will become PD5. That's going to be a way to report out to the workforce on this pilot, what it was about, what we've learned so far. We may at that point also have some information about bridge work that other states are doing. And then again, to get do some surveying of the broader workforce. So that can also inform the design that we're working on. So those are just some things I would add to this. You can see how many, like there's a lot here and it all interrelates and it all builds as we go along.